My grandparents invited me to a lavish family dinner, but told me to sit with servants. The heavy cream envelope felt out of place in my stack of bills and junk mail. My name, Morgan Harrington, was written in elegant calligraphy across the front, a stark contrast to the printed labels on my electric bill and takeout menus. I turned it over in my hands, running my finger across the embossed family crest on the back. The Harrington family crest. My family, technically speaking, though they'd spent years making sure I understood, I wasn't truly one of them. I almost threw it away without opening it. Why would I want to hear from people who had treated my mother like an outcast simply for falling in love with someone they deemed unworthy? People who hadn't even bothered to attend her funeral 4 years ago? People who had never once reached out to see if I was okay after losing both my parents? But curiosity is a powerful thing. I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out an invitation card that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Gold embossed lettering announced a grand family gathering at the Harrington estate, scheduled for the following Saturday evening. Well, that's weird, I muttered to my empty apartment. I flipped the card over, half expecting to find, "Just kidding, you're still not welcome," scrawled on the back. Instead, there was a handwritten note. "Your presence is specially requested. We have important family matters to discuss." The signature at the bottom belonged to my grandfather, Edward Harrington III, patriarch of the family and CEO of Harrington Holdings. A man who had looked straight through me the last time I saw him at my mother's funeral, as if I were a stranger who had wandered in off the street. I tossed the invitation onto my coffee table and sank into my worn couch. The springs creaked beneath me, a familiar sound in my modest one-bedroom apartment. From my window, I could see the city skyline. Not the pristine view from the hills where the Harringtons lived, but my own little corner of the world that I'd built without their help. My phone buzzed with a text from my best friend, Zoe. "Still on for drinks tonight?" I typed back, "Need a rain check. Family drama just landed in my mailbox." Her response was immediate. "The fancy Harringtons? Spill." I snapped a photo of the invitation and sent it to her. 3 dots appeared immediately, followed by, "OMG, are you going?" It was a good question. Was I going to subject myself to their judgment again? Return to the place where I'd always felt like an intruder? The last time I'd been to the Harrington estate was when I was 16, dragged there by my mother for some holiday gathering. The cousins had snickered behind their hands at my department store dress. Aunt Victoria had loudly wondered if my unfortunate fashion sense came from my father's side. My grandfather had barely acknowledged my existence. My mother had squeezed my hand throughout the evening, her silent way of saying, "I'm sorry." We never went back after that night. Yet something about this invitation nagged at me. Important family matters could mean anything. Maybe someone was dying. Maybe there was some inheritance, though I doubted they'd include me in anything like that. Or maybe they wanted to formally cut ties with the last remnant of their rebellious daughter's legacy. I pulled up my laptop and typed Harrington Holdings News into the search bar. Several recent articles popped up, mostly financial reports and business news. Nothing scandalous or revealing. Whatever important family matters they wanted to discuss wasn't public knowledge. I looked at my calendar. I was supposed to meet with a potential client on Saturday, but I could reschedule. My small graphic design business was finally gaining traction, but it wasn't so busy that I couldn't move things around. The smart thing would be to ignore the invitation, to continue building my life separate from people who had made it clear I wasn't good enough for them. But as I stared at the elegant card on my coffee table, something shifted inside me. Not hope. I was long past hoping for acceptance from the Harringtons. No, it was something else. Something that felt a lot like curiosity mixed with a dash of defiance. I picked up my phone again. "I think I am going," I texted Zoe. "Maybe it's time to see what the Harringtons want after all these years. Want me to be your plus one? I can pretend to be your snooty European assistant." I smiled at her offer. "Thanks, but I think I need to do this alone." That night, I dreamed of the Harrington estate, the sprawling grounds, the marble staircase, the crystal chandeliers that had fascinated me as a child. In the dream, I walked through the grand halls, but instead of feeling small and out of place, I moved with confidence. The portraits of stern-faced Harrington ancestors seemed to watch me with something like unease. Saturday arrived faster than I expected. I stood in front of my closet, debating what to wear. Part of me wanted to show up in jeans and a t-shirt just to see the look on their faces. But another part, a part that sounded suspiciously like my mother, whispered that I should look my best. I settled on a simple black dress. Professional, elegant, but not trying too hard. I pulled my dark hair into a sleek bun and applied minimal makeup. The woman who stared back at me from the mirror looked composed, confident, and very much like my mother. "Well, Mom," I whispered to her memory, "let's see what they want." The taxi dropped me off at the wrought iron gates of the Harrington estate just as the sun was beginning to set. As we drove up the long, winding driveway, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The mansion looked exactly as I remembered it, imposing, elegant, a monument to old money and privilege. What I didn't expect was the flutter of satisfaction I felt as I stepped out onto the gravel driveway. Because what the Harringtons didn't know, what none of them could possibly suspect, was that I now owned every brick, every chandelier, every inch of the ground they walked on. And tonight, they were about to find out. The grand oak doors of the Harrington mansion swung open before I could even knock. Jenkins, the family butler who had been with the Harringtons for as long as I could remember, stood in the entryway. His eyes widened slightly when he saw me, the first crack in his professional demeanor I'd ever witnessed. "Miss Morgan," he said, recovering quickly. "It has been some time." "Hello, Jenkins," I replied, surprised that I remembered his name. "Yes, it has." He took my light jacket, his movements precise and formal. "The family is gathered in the grand ballroom. If you'll follow me." I trailed behind him through the marble-floored hallway, my heels clicking against the polished surface. The walls were lined with the same portraits I remembered, stern-faced Harrington ancestors who seemed to judge me with their painted eyes. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. Perhaps because I was different now. I could hear the murmur of voices and soft classical music growing louder as we approached the ballroom. Jenkins paused at the entrance, and I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Miss Morgan Harrington," Jenkins announced, his voice carrying across the room. The chatter didn't immediately cease, but it definitely dimmed. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, and whispers erupted like a swarm of disturbed bees. I recognized most of the faces, cousins, aunts, uncles, all dressed in designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. They looked exactly as I remembered, just a bit older, a bit more polished, still wearing the same expressions of practiced superiority. I straightened my shoulders and stepped into the room. A waiter passed by with a tray of champagne, and I took a glass, grateful for something to hold on to. "Morgan." My cousin Blake approached first, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "What a surprise. We didn't think you'd come." "Then why send the invitation?" I asked, taking a sip of champagne. He shrugged, the gesture too casual to be sincere. "Grandfather insisted. Family obligation and all that." Family obligation. As if the Harringtons had ever treated me like family. Blake's wife Elise sidled up next to him, her diamond necklace catching the light from the chandeliers. "Morgan, darling," she drawled, her eyes scanning my simple black dress. "How quaint you look. Is that off the rack?" Before I could answer, my Aunt Victoria appeared, her face tightened by too many cosmetic procedures. "Morgan, you've grown up." Her tone suggested this wasn't necessarily a compliment. "Your mother would be surprised to see you here." The mention of my mother sent a pang through my chest. "I'm sure she would be," I replied evenly, especially given how welcome we always felt. Victoria's smile thinned dangerously. "Elizabeth made her choices," she said, referring to my mother by her full name, as she always had. "We all live with our choices, don't we?" "Yes," I agreed, my gaze steady. "We certainly do." I spotted my grandfather across the room, holding court among a group of what appeared to be business associates. Edward Harrington III looked older than I remembered, his once black hair now completely silver, but he still stood ramrod straight, commanding attention with his mere presence. As if sensing my gaze, he looked up. Our eyes met across the crowded room. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise that I had actually shown up. Then his expression settled back into one of cool indifference, and he returned to his conversation without even a nod of acknowledgement. "Don't take it personally," said a voice beside me. My cousin Sophia, the only Harrington who had ever shown me any kindness. He's been like that with everyone lately. Business troubles, they say. I turned to her, genuinely pleased to see a friendly face. "Sophia, you look well." She did look well, though tired around the eyes. Unlike the rest of the Harringtons, who wore their wealth like armor, Sophia had always been more subdued, more genuine. "So do you," she said, and I believed she meant it. "I'm glad you came." Whatever she was about to say was cut off by the sound of a silver spoon tapping against crystal. Jenkins stood at the center of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, dinner is served. Please proceed to the dining room." The crowd began to move like a choreographed dance, everyone knowing exactly where to go. I followed the flow toward the massive dining room with its long, mahogany table that could seat 30 people comfortably. "Miss Morgan," Jenkins said, stepping in front of me. "If you would follow me, please." I frowned, confused, as he led me not toward the main table where the family was gathering, but to a smaller table set up near the back of the room. A table where the household staff was being seated. "There must be a mistake," I said, loud enough that nearby conversations paused. "I received an invitation to this family gathering." Jenkins looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting toward my grandfather, who had taken his seat at the head of the main table. "I was instructed that family members are to be seated at the main table," he said quietly. "Your seat is here." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, someone snickered. My cousin Blake, I was certain, and like a dam breaking, soft laughter rippled through the room. Not everyone laughed. Sophia looked mortified, and a few of the older relatives had the decency to appear uncomfortable. But my grandfather? He watched the scene unfold with cold detachment, making no move to correct the situation. Heat rose to my face, not from embarrassment, but from anger. This wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate, a calculated humiliation designed to put me in my place, to remind me that no matter what I achieved, I would never be a true Harrington in their eyes. Jenkins looked genuinely apologetic. "Miss Morgan, It's fine." I cut him off, my voice steady despite the anger coursing through me. I smiled at the staff members already seated at the table, who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. "I'd be honored to dine with you all." I took my seat with as much dignity as I could muster, aware of the eyes on me, the whispers, the barely concealed satisfaction on some faces. My hands trembled slightly as I placed my napkin in my lap, but I willed them to be still. Let them have their moment, I thought. Let them think they've won. They had no idea who they were dealing with now. No idea that the mansion they were so proud of, the estate that was the physical embodiment of the Harrington legacy, now belonged to me. As the first course was served, I caught Sophia's eye across the room. She mouthed, "I'm sorry," with a genuinely pained expression. I gave her a small nod and turned my attention to my plate. I wasn't here for their approval anyway. I was here for something far more satisfying. I was here for justice. The first course was some sort of delicate soup with a French name I couldn't pronounce. I sipped it slowly, watching the Harringtons from my position of forced exile. The staff around me ate in awkward silence, occasionally shooting sympathetic glances my way. "They did this to humiliate you," whispered Marta, one of the housekeepers I remembered from childhood visits. Her accent was still thick after all these years. "It's not right." "It's fine," I assured her, though it wasn't. "I've dealt with worse." And I had. Much worse. After my mother died of cancer 4 years ago, I had nothing. The modest life insurance barely covered the funeral expenses. My father, who had already worked himself to the bone at his construction job trying to give us a decent life, collapsed at her graveside. Heart attack, the doctor said, brought on by stress and grief. I lost both parents within a week. The Harringtons didn't attend my father's funeral. My grandfather sent flowers to my mother's, expensive, elaborate arrangements that seemed more like a statement of wealth than of mourning. But not one of them called to see if I was okay. Not one of them offered help. I was 22, halfway through college on a partial scholarship, suddenly alone in the world with no safety net. I glanced across the dining room at my grandfather, cutting into his filet mignon with surgical precision. He could have helped with a snap of his fingers. The Harrington fortune, built over generations in banking and real estate, was vast enough that they wouldn't have even noticed what to me would have been life-changing assistance. Instead, I dropped out of college. I couldn't afford tuition and needed to work full-time. I moved into a tiny studio apartment, took 3 jobs, and barely slept for months. Waitressing during the day, bartending at night, and picking up graphic design gigs whenever I could. My father had taught me the value of hard work, and my mother had always encouraged my creativity. I honored them both by never giving up. "More wine, miss?" asked one of the servers, a young man who couldn't hide his curiosity about the family drama unfolding before him. "Yes, please," I said, smiling at him. He wasn't part of this game the Harringtons were playing. I sipped the expensive wine and thought about the night that changed everything. It was almost 2 years after my parents died. I'd managed to build a small client base for my graphic design work and was down to just one service job. I was scrolling through real estate listings, not to buy, but for design inspiration for a client's website, when I saw it. The Coleman House, a historic property on the edge of town, rumored to be owned by a reclusive millionaire. It had just hit the market at a surprisingly low price. What caught my eye wasn't the house itself, but the name of the seller, Harrington Holdings. My grandfather's company. Curious, I dug deeper. It took some research, but I discovered something interesting. Harrington Holdings had been quietly selling off assets. Not just the Coleman House, but commercial properties, art collections, even some of their longer-held real estate investments. Something was wrong with the family finances. I reached out to an old college friend who worked in finance. He did some digging and confirmed my suspicions. The Harringtons were in trouble. A series of bad investments, a few lawsuits from disgruntled business partners, and some significant tax issues had put a strain on even their considerable resources. They were selling assets to maintain appearances, to keep up the facade of unlimited wealth while stemming the bleeding behind the scenes. That's when an idea began to form. A crazy, impossible idea. I had managed to save a modest amount despite my struggles. Not enough to buy property, certainly, but enough to invest. I took a risk and put everything into a promising tech startup founded by another college friend. 6 months later, the company was acquired by a major corporation, and my small investment multiplied tenfold. It still wasn't Harrington money, but it was enough to get the attention of venture capitalists. I leveraged that success into a small investment firm, using my design skills to create a professional persona that belied my age and experience. I called it Phoenix Capital, rising from the ashes just as I had. I built relationships, made smart investments, and watched my money grow, all while keeping an eye on the increasingly desperate asset sales of Harrington Holdings. Then, just 3 months ago, I saw the listing. Not on any public market, but through an exclusive real estate network I had strategically joined. The Harrington estate itself was being quietly shopped to potential buyers. The asking price was astronomical, of course, but significantly less than its true value. They needed a quick, discreet sale. I set up a meeting through intermediaries, created an elaborate shell company that couldn't be traced back to me, used my accumulated knowledge of the Harringtons' financial situation to negotiate ruthlessly. And then I bought their legacy out from under them. The look on the real estate agent's face when I signed the final papers was priceless. I made only one unusual request, that the sale remain confidential until I chose to reveal it, and that the Harringtons be allowed to continue living in the mansion for 3 more months. Long enough for me to plan my next move. Long enough to receive their invitation to this dinner. Across the room, my grandfather stood and tapped his glass with a silver spoon. The conversations died down as everyone turned their attention to him. "I've gathered you all here tonight," he began, his voice still commanding despite his age, "because we have important family matters to discuss. Matters that affect the Harrington legacy." I set down my wine glass, my heart racing. This was it. They didn't know I owned the estate yet. The confidentiality agreement had seen to that. They had invited me here to discuss family matters, completely unaware that I held their fate in my hands. Had my grandfather discovered the truth somehow? Was this dinner an attempt to make amends before I revealed myself as their new landlord? Or was there something else going on? As the staff cleared our plates for the next course, I caught Sophia looking at me again. There was something in her expression, not just sympathy, but worry. Whatever was about to happen, she knew about it. And judging by her face, it wasn't going to be good. I straightened in my chair. Let them try their worst. I had survived everything else they had thrown at me. And this time, I had the upper hand. My grandfather's announcement hung in the air. The Harrington legacy. As if that meant anything to me anymore. As you all know, he continued, his voice echoing in the vast dining room, the Harrington name has stood for excellence and integrity for generations. We have faced challenges before and overcome them through unity and strength of character. I nearly choked on my wine. Unity? The man who had abandoned his own daughter and granddaughter was lecturing about family unity. Recent business setbacks have required certain adjustments, he said carefully. The family members exchanged glances. So they did know about the financial troubles. But I'm pleased to announce that we have secured new investors who will ensure the Harrington legacy continues for generations to come. New investors? I leaned forward slightly. Which brings me to the reason I've asked Morgan to join us tonight. All eyes turned to me. I kept my expression neutral, though my heart was racing. Did he know? Was this all an elaborate setup? Despite our differences with Elizabeth, blood remains blood, my grandfather said, his tone suggesting he was making a great concession. Morgan is a Harrington, however distant, and we believe in keeping family matters within the family. He gestured to Jenkins, who approached with an envelope on a silver tray. My grandfather took it and held it up. This document represents an opportunity, Morgan. A gesture of reconciliation, if you will. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something wasn't right. Jenkins walked over and presented the tray to me. I took the envelope, aware of the anticipation in the room. Whatever was happening, it was clearly entertainment for the rest of the family. I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a legal document, a waiver of inheritance rights. We're restructuring some family assets, my grandfather explained, watching me closely. All family members are signing these forms. In exchange, you'll receive a one-time payment of $50,000. Quite generous, considering your position in the family. $50,000. A pittance to them, but a sum they knew would be significant to someone they assumed was struggling. And in exchange, I would sign away any claim to Harrington assets, including, presumably, any legal challenge I might make to the sale of the estate they didn't yet know I owned. It was a setup, a trap designed to legally block me from any claim to family assets while making them appear magnanimous. I looked up from the document to find every eye in the room on me. My cousins were barely containing their smirks. My grandfather waited with the confidence of a man who had never been refused anything in his life. Is this why I was invited? I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. To sign away my rights in exchange for what amounts to pocket change for a Harrington? My grandfather's expression hardened. It's a fair offer, Morgan. More than fair, given the circumstances. And if I refuse? Then you'll receive nothing, he said flatly. The choice is yours. The room was silent, the tension palpable. This was their grand plan, to humiliate me, then offer me what they considered charity in exchange for my signature on a document that would protect their interests. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I smiled, folded the document carefully, and placed it back in the envelope. No, thank you, I said, rising from my seat. My grandfather's eyebrows shot up. Clearly, this wasn't the response he had expected. Perhaps you misunderstand the opportunity being presented to you, he said, his tone sharpening. I understand perfectly, I replied, and I'm declining. Whispers erupted around the table. Cousin Blake leaned over to his wife and muttered something that made her laugh behind her hand. My grandfather's face reddened slightly. Perhaps this is a discussion best continued in private, he said, gesturing toward his study. Actually, I said, raising my voice slightly so everyone could hear, I think this is exactly the right setting for what I have to say. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folded document of my own. Unlike the single sheet they had presented me, mine was several pages thick, bound with a blue cover. Before we continue with dinner, I have an announcement of my own to make. The room quieted. My grandfather frowned, clearly unaccustomed to having his carefully orchestrated events disrupted. What is this? He demanded. This, I said, holding up the document, is the deed to the Harrington estate. Your home. Confusion spread across the faces around the table. What are you talking about? Aunt Victoria snapped. I smiled, savoring the moment. 3 months ago, Harrington Holdings quietly put this estate up for sale through an exclusive broker. It was purchased by Phoenix Capital Investments. I paused, letting that sink in. My company. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. That's impossible, my grandfather said, but his face had gone pale. Is it? I opened the deed and began to read aloud. This property, known as the Harrington Estate, including the main house, grounds, and all fixtures therein, is hereby transferred to Phoenix Capital Investments, represented by its CEO, Morgan Harrington. I continued reading the legal language, watching as shock, disbelief, and then horror spread across their faces. You're lying, Blake said, standing abruptly. This is some kind of sick joke. Jenkins, I called out. Who signs your paychecks now? The butler cleared his throat uncomfortably. Phoenix Capital, sir. The confirmation from Jenkins seemed to break something in the room. My Aunt Victoria gasped. My cousin Elise gripped the edge of the table. And my grandfather, for the first time in my life, I saw something I never thought I'd see in Edward Harrington III's eyes. Fear. You see, I said, returning the deed to my purse. While you were all busy looking down on me, judging me, I was busy building something. Something strong enough to buy your precious legacy right out from under you. Why didn't we know about this? My grandfather demanded, looking around the table as if someone might have the answer. The sale included a confidentiality clause, I explained. At my request. I wanted to tell you myself after you'd welcomed me into your home. I gestured around at the opulent dining room. My home, as it turns out. The stunned silence was broken by a single sound, Sophia's soft laughter. All heads turned to her in shock. I'm sorry, she said, not sounding sorry at all. But you have to admit, it's rather perfect. In that moment, as I stood among the people who had rejected me, who had humiliated me, who had thought so little of me, I felt a sense of satisfaction unlike anything I'd ever experienced. They had seated me at the servants' table in my own house. My grandmother was the first to recover from the shock. Eleanor Harrington had been sitting quietly throughout dinner, a regal figure draped in pearls and silk, saying little. Now she rose shakily to her feet, her lined face contorted with indignation. How dare you, she hissed, her voice trembling. How dare you come into this home? My home, I corrected gently, and make such preposterous claims. They're not claims, grandmother. They're legal facts. I turned to address the entire table. The sale was completed 3 months ago. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every staff salary since then has been paid by me. The staff members at my table shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the family they had served for years. They'd known, of course. They'd had to be informed when the ownership changed. But they'd kept my secret, whether out of loyalty to their new employer or enjoyment of the dramatic reveal. I couldn't be sure. My Uncle Richard, my mother's older brother, slammed his fist on the table, causing the crystal to jump. This is fraud. Deception. We'll have our lawyers. Please do call your lawyers, I interrupted calmly. They'll confirm everything I've said. The sale was completely legal, conducted through reputable brokers and attorneys. Harrington Holdings needed liquidity. I provided it. At a criminally low price, my grandfather growled, finding his voice at last. The price you agreed to, I countered. The price you were desperate enough to accept because the alternative was public bankruptcy and the complete collapse of the Harrington name. A glass shattered. Cousin Blake had crushed his wine glass in his hand, red liquid seeping into the white tablecloth like blood. No one moved to help him. They were all too busy processing what I'd said. Public bankruptcy. The collapse of the Harrington name. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. "You knew," Aunt Victoria accused, turning on my grandfather. "You knew we were in that much trouble, and you didn't tell us?" The unified front of the family was cracking before my eyes. Years of secrets, of pretense, were starting to unravel. "I was handling it," my grandfather snapped. "I've always handled everything." "By selling our home?" Victoria's voice rose dangerously. "Our legacy?" "To her?" Blake added, gesturing at me with his bleeding hand. "He didn't know it was me," I said, almost feeling sorry for my grandfather as his family turned on him. Almost. Phoenix Capital was represented by intermediaries. The Harringtons were too proud to meet directly with the buyers anyway. Sophia stood up, smoothing her dress. "I think we could all use some air," she suggested, ever the peacemaker. "Let's take a moment to process this development." But no one was listening to her. The room had erupted into chaos. Family members shouting accusations at each other, and my grandfather, at me. Jenkins and the other staff members retreated to the kitchen, leaving just Marta beside me. "You should go," she whispered urgently. "They are very angry." "I'm not afraid of them," I replied, though my heart was racing. I hadn't expected quite this level of fury. My grandfather suddenly rose from his chair, commanding attention even in his moment of defeat. The room quieted, years of obedience to his authority momentarily overriding the panic. "What do you want?" he asked me directly, his voice dangerously quiet. "Money? Is that it? To extort us now that you have leverage?" I shook my head. "No, grandfather. I don't want your money." "Then what?" "Revenge for perceived slights." "Perceived?" I laughed, the sound hollow even to my own ears. "You abandoned my mother when she needed you most. You ignored me after both my parents died. You invited me here tonight to humiliate me and trick me into signing away rights to a family fortune that you've already lost. Those aren't perceived slights. They're actions that reveal exactly who you are." The silence that followed was heavy with realization. Even those family members who had been ready to defend my grandfather seemed to hesitate, the truth of my words sinking in. "So yes," I continued, "I suppose you could call this revenge. But it's also justice." "And what does justice look like to you?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. "What are your terms?" This was the moment I had planned for, dreamed of. The moment when Edward Harrington III would be forced to negotiate with me, to recognize my power. But standing there, seeing the fear and confusion on their faces, I felt a strange emptiness. This wasn't as satisfying as I had imagined it would be, but I had come too far to turn back now. "My terms are simple," I said, my voice clear and steady. "You all need to find new accommodations. I'm selling the estate." Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a fresh wave of outrage. "You can't do that," Blake shouted. "You most certainly can't," my grandmother added, clutching at her pearls. "This house has been in the Harrington family for generations, and now it's not," I replied simply. "Now it belongs to me, and I can do with it what I please." "You're evicting us?" Aunt Victoria's voice was shrill with disbelief. "Your own family?" I turned to her, feeling a flash of genuine anger. "Family? Is that what we are now? After years of treating my mother like an outcast? After ignoring me except when you wanted to make me feel small?" I shook my head. "No, Victoria. We're not family. We're just people who happen to share some DNA. And yes, I'm evicting you." My grandfather's face had gone from pale to mottled red. For a moment, I thought he might collapse, and a flicker of concern passed through me. Despite everything, I didn't want to actually harm him. But then he straightened, his pride reasserting itself. "How long do we have?" 30 days, I replied. I've already scheduled meetings with potential buyers. One of them wants to turn the estate into a boutique hotel. The idea of their precious family home being transformed into a commercial property, open to the public, seemed to horrify them more than anything else I'd said. "You little." Blake started toward me, but Sophia intercepted him, placing a firm hand on his chest. "Enough," she said sharply. "She's within her legal rights. We should be grateful for the 30 days. I met my cousin's eyes, seeing a complexity of emotions there: regret, respect, perhaps even a hint of pride. She had always been the reasonable one, the kind one. In another life, we might have been friends. "Why are you defending her?" Blake demanded. Sophia sighed. "Because she's right, Blake. This is justice." As the arguments erupted again around me, I slipped my purse over my shoulder. I had said what I came to say, done what I came to do. It was time to leave them to process the new reality, a reality where I held all the power and they held none. The morning after the dinner party dawned bright and clear. I sat in my car at the end of the long driveway to the Harrington estate, watching as a parade of luxury vehicles pulled up to the mansion. Real estate agents, potential buyers, appraisers, all arriving precisely on schedule. I had meant everything I said last night. The house was going up for sale immediately. The Harringtons would be out within 30 days. At least, that had been the plan. I watched as my grandfather emerged from the front doors, standing tall on the steps as he greeted the first of the real estate agents. Even in defeat, Edward Harrington III maintained his dignity. Something about his posture, proud but slightly stooped with age, sparked an unexpected feeling in my chest. My phone rang. It was Zoe. "Well?" she demanded without preamble. "How did Operation Revenge go? Did you crush them? I want every delicious detail." I smiled despite myself. "It went exactly as planned. You should have seen their faces when I told them I owned the house. Epic. And now they're all getting evicted? Please tell me Blake is having a meltdown." I hesitated, watching as more cars pulled into the circular driveway. "That's the plan," I said, but even to my own ears, my voice lacked conviction. Zoe, who knew me better than anyone, caught it immediately. "Morgan, you're not getting soft on me, are you? After everything they did?" "No, of course not," I said quickly. "It's just what?" I sighed, trying to organize my thoughts. "Revenge doesn't feel the way I thought it would." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. I thought I'd feel triumphant, vindicated. But instead, I just feel empty." Another car pulled up, a modest sedan that stood out among the luxury vehicles. Sophia emerged, looking tired but composed. She glanced around, spotted my car, and started walking in my direction. "I need to go," I told Zoe. "I'll call you later." I ended the call just as Sophia reached my car. I rolled down the window. "I thought that might be you," she said, leaning down to look at me. "May I join you?" I nodded, and she walked around to the passenger side and slid in beside me. "Quite the commotion up there," she observed, gesturing toward the house. "Yes," I agreed. "Real estate moves quickly when the price is right." Sophia studied me for a moment. "Is this really what you want, Morgan?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "Selling the house. Evicting everyone. Is that really going to give you what you need?" I frowned. "It's not about what I need. It's about consequences for their actions." "I understand that," she said gently. "But after the consequences, then what? Will this heal the hurt they caused you?" I didn't have an answer for that. I watched as my grandfather shook hands with another agent, his movements stiff but determined. "Grandfather had a mild heart attack last night," Sophia said quietly, "after you left." A chill went through me. "Is he all right?" "He will be. Physically, at least." She paused. "His pride may never recover." I should have felt satisfaction at that news. Instead, I felt a surprising pang of guilt. I didn't want to actually harm him, I admitted. "I know." Sophia smiled faintly. "That's why I'm here. Because despite everything, you're not cruel, Morgan. You're hurt, and you have every right to be. But cruelty isn't in your nature. That's one way you're different from some of the Harringtons. We sat in silence for a moment, watching the activity at the house. What would my mother have wanted? I asked suddenly, surprising myself with the question. Sophia considered this carefully. Elizabeth was kind, even when people didn't deserve it. But she was also strong. She stood up for herself when it mattered. She looked at me. You remind me of her, you know. A lump formed in my throat. I miss her. I know. I miss her too. Sophia reached over and squeezed my hand briefly. Whatever you decide to do with the house, I'll support you. Even if the rest of the family doesn't understand. She opened the car door to leave, then paused. Just make sure it's a decision you can live with, Morgan. Revenge might feel good for a moment, but it's a heavy thing to carry forever. I watched her walk back toward the house, her words echoing in my mind. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment. The deed to the Harrington estate spread out on my coffee table. The power I now held over my family's legacy was absolute. I could destroy it all with a signature. But Sophia's question kept returning to me. Is this really what you want? I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd never thought I would call voluntarily. Hello. My grandfather's voice sounded older, more fragile than it had last night.
It's Morgan, I said.
We need to talk. 2 weeks later, I stood in the grand ballroom of the Harrington estate, my estate, watching as workers transformed the space. Tables were being arranged, caterers bustled about, and a podium stood at the front of the room. Jenkins approached, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Everything is proceeding according to your specifications, Miss Morgan. The guests will begin arriving in an hour. Thank you, Jenkins, I said, smiling at him. And my grandfather? In his study. He asked not to be disturbed until it's time. I nodded and made my way through the familiar corridors to the heavy oak door of Edward Harrington III's study. I knocked once and entered without waiting for a response. He was standing by the window, gazing out at the gardens, a tumbler of scotch in his hand. He turned as I entered, his face unreadable. It's almost time, I said. He nodded, set down his glass, and straightened his tie. I still don't understand why you're doing this. I met his eyes steadily. Because destroying things is easy. Building something new is harder. And I didn't buy this house to destroy it. I bought it to reclaim it. Later, as I stood at the podium facing a room full of community leaders, reporters, and yes, Harrington family members, I felt a peculiar sense of peace. It is my pleasure, I announced, to officially establish the Elizabeth Harrington Foundation, dedicated to providing educational opportunities for first-generation college students and those who have lost parents during their academic careers. I glanced at my grandfather, standing stoically beside me, and saw something I'd never seen before in his eyes: respect. The foundation will be headquartered here, at what will now be known as the Harrington Community Center, open to all who need its resources. As applause filled the room, I realized that this, not eviction notices or public humiliation, was truly the last laugh. Not a laugh of mockery or revenge, but one of triumph, of rising above, of creating something meaningful from the ashes of pain. My mother would have been proud,